with our first speaker, John Vaillant. He's an author and a freelance writer whose work has appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, National Geographic, and The Walrus, among others. His first book, The Golden Spruce, was a bestseller and won several awards, including the Governor General's and Writers' Trust Awards for nonfiction. His second nonfiction book, The Tiger, won the BC Achievement Award for nonfiction, was a bestseller, and has been published in 17 languages. In 2014, Vaillant won the Wyndham Campbell Prize, which is a global award for nonfiction. In 2015, he published his first work of fiction, The Jaguar's Children, which was long-listed for the Dublin IMPAC and Kirkus Fiction Prizes, and was a finalist for the Writers' Trust Fiction Prize. And his latest book, which many of you will know, Fireweather, is a #1 national bestseller. It has won the Baillie Gifford Prize in the UK, the Writers' Trust Shaughnessy Cohen Prize, and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Award in the US, and the Writers' Trust Nonfiction Prize. It's been named one of the 10 best books of 2023 by the New York Times, among many other prominent publications. And I can say on a personal note, I am very excited to have John here with us tonight, to be able to share with us his insights and his brilliance, and maybe he might even give us, one of his awards, because he has so many of them. I introduce you to John Vaillant.
Oh, wow. Thanks for that. Thank you all for coming out. You're a lot closer to winter than we are in Vancouver. I don't get that many invitations to Alberta. But every one that I do get has been really memorable. And I have the sense here of kind of being in this kind of coalescence of some kind of brain trust. It's really, really good to be with you. Honored to be entrusted with, I guess, kicking the conference off. A lot of people worked hard to kind of wrangle this, to get you into the room, but also to get me up here. And so Jason and Ricardo and Kayla and some other folks, I've just been in correspondence with them for, I think, more than a year now, actually, trying to get this together. And I'm glad that it's finally happened. I've met some of my Twitter X friends in person already. That's really exciting and kind of surreal. All of you are, but I was born and raised in the United States, and my family's been in North America for over 400 years. And so to see what happened earlier or last week, I'm really in shock and grief around that. I really can't proceed without acknowledging the fact that the experience of, I was just in the States in Salt Lake City, and a lot of people very much like yourselves, a lot of them really in shock. Coming out to see me was sort of their first time out of the house and their first time moderately sober. And it really, people are taking it hard down there. It's a strange and terrifying time. I feel like we're in a kind of precarious calm before the storm, and the Canadian border is not a protection. You know that. It's alive and walking here too. I started researching Fireweather in 2016, and it's feeling less and less like a coincidence that 2016 is when I began studying how and why individuals, communities, and governments respond so inadequately to life-threatening disasters, despite ready access to accurate and detailed information about the risks. It didn't occur to me really until last week that Fireweather was a near-perfect allegory for the arrival of an unfettered klepto-fascist regime. But as you'll see, if you read Fireweather, or if you know the histories of Standard Oil or the Hudson's Bay Company, or if you watch the United States in the coming months and years, these energies move across the land with similar speed, rapacity, and destructiveness. And for nearly a decade now, it's been abundantly clear that any leader whose re-election is cheered with equal zeal by Vladimir Putin, Jeff Bezos, and the petroleum industry is a clear and present danger to democracy and the living world. And I don't think Leonardo DiCaprio had this in mind. I don't think he was thinking about a second Trump term when he made Don't Look Up. But we have 2 months until impact. And I'm really feeling that. I'm really feeling the clock. Failure of imagination is a human specialty, so much so that the Roman poet and philosopher Lucretius addressed it directly more than 2,000 years ago. And today, this perceptual glitch is called the Lucretius problem. It occurs when humans base their estimation of future events on their own limited past experience. The Lucretius problem was the signal feature of the response to Alberta, Canada's Fort McMurray fire, which, as you know, drove the largest, most rapid evacuation due to fire in modern times. By now, it's clear to probably everybody in this room that climate disruption, of which fire is just one manifestation, is the issue of our time. It'll impact every aspect of our lives for the rest of our lives. And if there was ever any doubt that this was so, the past 2 summers have settled it. We all saw the smoke, and way too many of us have seen the fire, especially here in Alberta. Weather's different now. Fire's different now. The Earth's expressions are intensifying and accelerating. A century ago, Ernest Hemingway wrote a novel called The Sun Also Rises, and there are a couple of lines in it that have been on my mind lately. Oh, look at that. I didn't realize that slide was in there. That's, God, that guy shows up everywhere. And that's actually from a German magazine, as you can probably gather, from 2016, but they were prescient. That's what I was thinking about when I was thinking about Don't Look Up, but we'll move on, because we must. This line from The Sun Also Rises, "How did you go bankrupt?" Bill asked. "2 ways, Mike said, gradually and then suddenly. This applies equally well to the last 50 years of observed and tracked climatic changes. And in July of 2023, Thomas Smith, an environmental geographer at the London School of Economics, made a sober observation to the BBC. He said, "I'm not aware of a similar period when all parts of the climate system were in record-breaking or abnormal territory. And 2023 was a turning point. What appears to be happening now is a nonlinear acceleration. Look at any metric of planetary distress. So these are global temperatures over the past, averaged out for autumn, over the past 40 years. And we see, natural fluctuation. That's part of Earth's atmosphere. And then we see it start to lurch upward. And you'll see how that tracks with the Keeling curve of CO2 later. But then you see 2023 taking this rather precipitous jump into warmer territory. These are North Atlantic sea surface temperatures, again, over the same period, the past 40 years. That colorful spaghetti that's getting steadily more orange, more from yellow and blue, is the warming. 2023 is that red line that really seems to be off by itself, and then creeping in from the left is 2024. And this is what 2024 looks like at the North Pole. Again, the last 40 years, the dotted line is a rough average, but 2024 just has another plan. We're all feeling that in different ways. These extremes are widespread now, but that doesn't mean they're normal. Some early map makers described unknown parts of the globe as terra incognita. Our planet and our civilization are now entering clima incognita, the unknown climate. And in so doing, we are departing the Holocene epoch, the Goldilocks zone of relative climate stability that enabled us to build the world as we know it over the past 12,000 years. So to borrow from another children's story, The Three Little Pigs, we've built our homes and infrastructure out of 20th century straw, and now there's a 21st century wolf at the door, and that wolf is climate change in the form of extreme weather. We, all of us, must recognize this moment for what it is, the beginning of a new era of civilizational retreat, contraction, and consolidation. Call it the post-Holocene. That might feel frightening and it might feel negative, but I really don't see it that way. To me, it feels like we're getting sober after a really long and wicked binge. And we're coming to now, and we're taking stock. And it's better to be sober, and it's better to be clear-headed. And we have a lot of agency. Canada's petroleum industry is in first-degree denial about this, but some in the insurance industry are paying very close attention In fact, the insurance business has entered a period of crisis in which wide swaths of the United States, the Gulf Coast and the West Coast so far, are becoming uninsurable. In the past 4 years, more than 50 insurance companies have withdrawn coverage from Florida and Louisiana alone. Canada is facing this too, as premiums rise rapidly in risk-prone parts of the country. Capitalism, already a dubious proposition, has a hard time functioning without protections of this kind, and so does our society. Now, there's a term I want to introduce to you, discontinuity. There's a fellow, Alex Steffen, he's a futurist working out of Berkeley. I urge you to look him up, look at his work. He is proactive, fearless, kind of gimlet-eyed, and he is making plans for how we adapt, and he is really ready to share that information. So a discontinuity is an event or situation wherein past experience ceases to be a useful guide to future problem solving. Firefighters have been experiencing discontinuity more and more often over the past decade or two, and the past couple of years have been relentless. How are you supposed to respond to this? So fire radiative power is the raw energy coming off the leading edge of a wildfire. Normally it's measured in megawatts, but because Canadian fires are so big, this chart is in terawatts. Neil Leroux out of the University of Nevada calculated the fire radiative power coming out of Canadian wildfires over the past 10 years or so. We can see in the lower right-hand corner, it sort of goes horizontal at a certain point in the year, and we never really get above 10 terawatts. And we know we've had some hellacious fire seasons over the past decade, but nothing was like 2023. Again, it's like the water temperature in Svalbard. It's like someone tied a balloon to it. So that's 42 terawatts of energy generated by Canada's fires alone, and a terawatt is 1 trillion watts. A terawatt is what you power cities like Beijing and Tokyo with. So that's what's coming out of our forests. Another way to measure it is with area burned. Again, we had some real humdinger seasons over the past decade, but they were nothing in terms of area compared to 2023. And that chart was finished off in August, and the country kept burning through October, so I think it topped out around 18 million hectares, which is the area of Florida or Oklahoma or Uruguay. Another way to measure it is in 2023, we had 250,000 Canadians on the road, driven from their homes by fire. 10 years ago, if you'd ask, who do you know who's been evacuated? Certain parts of the country might know some people, but now probably every single Canadian knows somebody who's been evacuated due to fire. It's an extraordinary moment we find ourselves in. Never before have technology, culture, and nature been moving so quickly, simultaneously. And one reason why I think we have a hard time wrapping our heads around this is because we're used to being the stars of the show. From arrowheads to AI, our species has progressed steadily faster than geologic time. But now, geologic time, climate time, atmospheric time, glacier time is moving as fast, in some cases faster than we are, faster than technology, faster than history. The world we thought we knew is changing under our feet because we changed it. So I began to understand the implications of this acceleration when Fort McMurray caught on fire back in 2016. Fort Mac's a good place to learn about fire and petroleum and how they fuel the volatile and all-consuming appetites of petrocapitalism. There are a couple of pieces to this, and I'm going to go through them in the order that I first explored them, but I'll start with fire. If you live in Canada, here's a term you need to know: the wildland urban interface. Most of you probably know it already. It's where the built environment butts up against the wild land. There's a lot of it around Edmonton, and increasingly it's where fires come from and where they enter our communities. This is a site we're way too familiar with. If you want to see a wildfire, this is probably the one you want to see. It's on the far side of a ridge. You can be pretty confident in Alberta that some really competent people are on top of it and keeping track of it. The pale smoke indicates that it's not completely raging, but this is what people were looking at on May 2nd in Fort McMurray. So this photo was taken from Fire Hall 5, about 5 or 7 kilometers south of downtown. It's 6 p.m. You can see the sun there, and what we see also are these really tight black coils, which indicate a fire of great intensity. I'm going to read a little section from the book that starts on the morning of May 3rd. In Fort McMurray, May 3rd began differently for everyone, but it ended the same. For Chandra Linder, it began with a rite of spring. Linder was a labor relations advisor who worked for Syncrude. Linder's husband, Corey, an engineer, was employed there too, and so were many of their friends. Blonde, with a pixie cut, Linder is fit and warm and does not suffer fools. It makes sense once you get to know her, but to an outsider it might be surprising to see someone so polished and female in such a remote, industry-oriented, testosterone-heavy place. Now, Edmonton is probably the one place I don't need to tell people what the ratio, the gender ratio is up at site, but it's around 25-1. And if any of you have worked up there or know women who've worked up there, you know it can be kind of weird. You know, it's kind of a little bit like being in prison. There's a lot of eyes on you. And who wrote about that incredibly well was Kate Beaton in Ducks. If you haven't read that book, Ducks, it's a really powerful, beautiful, painful piece of work, kind of a masterpiece, honestly. For work, Linder dresses accordingly. Minimal makeup, high collars, dark pants, no heels. Clothes suitable for climbing in and out of trucks and SUVs, for working in a world of working men. Linder had already seen the smoke plume southwest of town because everyone had seen it. A windswept cauliflower of billowing grays and browns that appeared to have sprouted full-blown from the forest on Sunday afternoon. It had been growing since then, but it was still many kilometers away, and it wasn't the only one. Over the weekend, the Linders had hosted friends evacuated due to another fire. It was almost a lark. They took photos of the big plume developing across the river the same way one would a sunset or a rainbow. Their friends went home the next day because forestry was on it. Boots were on the ground, water bombers were in the air. As far as the Linders were concerned, whatever was out there was being handled because that's what people do in Fort McMurray. They handle things. Certainly, the beginning of May was a little early for fires. There were still car-sized blocks of winter ice on the riverbanks, and some local lakes had yet to thaw, but otherwise this was nothing new. Fires cloud the horizon every spring and summer up here. As Chandra and Corey said, practically in unison, it happens every year. Given the unseasonable heat, it was 33 Celsius that day, breaking the standing record for May 3rd by 6 degrees, and the fact that 5 separate wildfires had ignited around the city that weekend, it's hard to overstate how unconcerned was Fort McMurray's citizenry. But if you were up at dawn on May 3rd, as Chandra Linder was, and you had seen the sky so full of summer promise as she had, you might understand why. The brilliance of that morning was so exceptional that after her morning shower, Linder did something she hadn't done in a long time. She pulled out her favorite navy blue suit with the skirt, picked some medium heels to go with it, and left her socks in the drawer. Thus attired, she headed off to work in Syncrude's head office. In her garage, there were a few vehicles to choose from, and in keeping with her outfit and her mood, Linder picked the car she calls the little one, a black Porsche that hadn't seen daylight in 6 months. So there was a census done the same year as the fire, 2016, and one of the things that it determined was that the median household income in Fort McMurray in 2016, 2 years after a major global downturn in oil prices, was still $200,000 a year. It's one of the richest municipalities in North America. Winters are long and dark in Fort McMurray, but this one was over. Spring was here, and Linder felt as beautiful and as hopeful as the day. So we're staying on May 3rd. We're going to jump ahead about 3.5 hours. Still feeling the symptoms of spring fever, Chandra Linder knocked off work at lunch and organized herself for a 2 o'clock meeting at Syncrude's downtown office in the Borealis building. With no traffic, it's a 30-minute drive down the highway. Still 20 kilometers north of downtown, she was rounding a long, gradual bend in the river when her windshield filled with something she did not recognize. When I got that first view of it, said Linder, I went, hang on a second. It was clear overhead, but to the south, it was black, black smoke with streaks of red in it. It took up the whole sky. I'm trying to make sense of this thing. I'm thinking, well, maybe it just looks closer than it is. I'm thinking maybe the red is the sun shining through smoke, but it's not the sun. It's in the wrong place. And then I realize it's flame. Linder had seen a lot of fire plumes, but this didn't look like any of them. So I pull over to the side of the highway and I call my guy Byron and I say, are we having this meeting? And he's like, no, we are not having this meeting. Don't come in. And I'm like, I'm looking at a wall of flames here. It was a short call, in part because no one was quite sure what to say next. What do you say on a beautiful spring day when the city where you live and conduct business appears to be on fire? After hanging up, Linder continued on to her exit, where she turned west, back up the hill and out of the river valley. Okay, she said, not right, but here's what I do. I'm going to go home anyway, drive past the dry cleaners. Well, I'm going to drop off my stuff at Sam's place because in my mind, the fire's still on the other side of the river, downtown. So I'm dropping my stuff off, and this guy comes in from the golf course in full golf apparel, and he's like, holy shit, we just got evacuated from the golf course. And I'm like, well, what are you doing here? And he says, well, I'm here to pick up my dry cleaning. And I said, what golf course were you on? Because we have two in town. And he says, Thickwood, meaning the fire has just jumped the river. The Athabasca River, by the Thickwood Golf Course, is half a kilometer wide. So, continued Linder, Sam the dry cleaner, who's our buddy, is on the phone to his wife. Honey, it just jumped the river. Get out. Get out. Get out. In all this craziness, Sam still takes my dry cleaning, logs it, and he's like, Tuesday good? And I'm like, yeah. Next Tuesday's great. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon on May 3rd, Linder tucked her laundry ticket safely in her wallet and aimed the Porsche for home. So that was 2 o'clock. And this is 2:45. So gradually and then suddenly. This is Beacon Hill. This photo was taken by Paul Ayerst. You can see the hood of his truck. He's shooting over his dashboard. These are fireballs, disembodied fireballs rolling over the road. Flames are 50 meters, 100 meters tall. Everything is on fire. Nothing is moving. It's the Tim Hortons drive-through lineup from hell because everybody is at a T-stop down on 63 because 63 is crawling because now tens of thousands of people are trying to get out. And looking over his dashboard there, he has the misfortune of seeing the taillights in front of him, and one of those is his daughter's car, and the other one is his wife's car. And there's nothing he can do. He cannot get out. It's too hot. And I asked him if he happened to notice his dashboard thermometer, and he said, I did. He said it was 66 Celsius. And while he's sitting there, idling with the fan blowing like crazy, a deer on fire runs into his truck. He's trying to call his wife. Everybody else is trying to call their husband, trying to call their wife, trying to call their kid. Towers are maxed out. He can see them, but he cannot communicate with them. He can't get to them. He can't protect them. That's a terrible thing for a parent. It's the worst thing, to see the people you love and not be able to protect them. What was going on with this fire, it was 33 Celsius. That was record-breaking heat for that day. But kind of more sinister and more invisible was the relative humidity. I didn't know much from relative humidity, but I looked because I was curious, and it was 12%. Where is 12% relative humidity normal? I didn't know, so I went looking around the world for where 12% relative humidity was normal. And you got to go to Death Valley in Southern California in the month of July to find relative humidity of 12%. So now when you transpose record-breaking heat and desert dryness to the boreal forest, which is already a charismatically flammable ecosystem, a naturally flammable ecosystem, and you goose it like that, it's like you sprayed it with gasoline, that combination of dryness and heat. And so you don't just get a fire, you get a firestorm. And that's what firefighters had to deal with. And so I coined a term, 21st century fire. One of its characteristics, its heat, its ferocity, its speed. There's several. Another one is it doesn't stop. So you'd look at this photo, looks like it's being taken at night. Only a firefighter could have taken it. But it was not taken on the night of May 3rd, wasn't taken on the night of May 4th. This is from May 5th. These fires don't stop. This fire burned in Fort McMurray for days and nights and days, expanding, expanding, expanding. So the fire doesn't sleep, but what about the firefighters? So these guys are duty-bound. There might be firefighters in this room. There might be firefighters who attended this fire. People were going 24 hours. People were going 48 hours. People watched their own houses burn and kept going and going, 56 hours. They're literally hallucinating, operating heavy machinery, trying to save the city they're charged to save. Water wasn't working. So what's happening here is we know roughly how powerful a fire hose jet is. It'll blow you out of your chair and send you out the door. So what's happening here, you can see where it turns gray. There's so much energy in that fire that it's bending the hose stream, sucking it into the core of the fire, vaporizing it, and sending it up into the column. And that column is now 45,000 feet tall and has punctured the stratosphere and become a pyrocumulonimbus fire system. These were not even in fire literature until the very late 1990s. People thought, fire scientists, atmospheric scientists, thought they only occurred over volcanoes. You think of Krakatoa and the lightning bolts coming out of it. That's what was coming out of the pyrocumulonimbus cloud over Fort McMurray. Lightning starting fires 20 kilometers away, 30 kilometers away. It became its own kind of perpetual motion fire system. And nothing can stop that. So the next time you're going to see that water, it's spiraled up the column to about 30,000 feet where it freezes, coalescing around bits of ash, carbon from the trees and houses, and comes back to Earth as black hail. And the only other time I've read about black hail was in Exodus in the Bible. So they gave up on the hoses, and they just tore the houses down. This is in Prospect. This was night 3. This is the newest neighborhood. So these houses are a year old, 600 grand a pop, state of the art, kind of middle class, all the gadgets, everything's, you can operate the whole thing from your phone. And these guys are tearing these houses down, pushing the trucks into the basements, clearing the place out, trying to lower the fire. That's all they could do. And so they actually managed to stop the fire in that part of the city, though it kept spreading and for many days after. But I interviewed these heavy equipment operators. They don't get interviewed very often. And they've got a lot of interesting things to say. And they saw some things that you really can't imagine. That was an amazing moment, spending time with them. This is a terrible sight. In 2016, this was a novel sight. Most of us hadn't seen it. If we'd seen photos of Slave Lake in 2011, maybe it was familiar. But otherwise, this was something most Canadians hadn't seen. Most North Americans really hadn't seen this. There were some really bad fires in California over the decades, and this kind of total destruction is another indicator of a 21st century fire. It consumes everything, and it melts, what it can't burn. So what I couldn't help noticing was how much these ruins looked like these ruins. These are the tar sands, you know, the bitumen mines north of Fort McMurray. It's what pays for those beautiful houses and those beautiful cars. In the back there is the Syncrude upgrader where Chandra used to work with her husband. Those weird, pale, oblong things in the upper right, those are basically kind of ziggurats of sulfur with a volume greater than the pyramids at Giza. And then in the foreground, those little shed-like box things, I probably don't need to tell you, they're T797 haulers, some of the biggest dump trucks in the world. Their tires are basically as tall as this ceiling. They weigh, 6 tons apiece. And they weigh 400 tons empty. And there's hundreds of these things running around up there. And the total area is around 1,600 square kilometers and growing of despoiled earth with really no plan to remediate it. There's no feasible way to fix what's broken up there, what's been broken. The lakes of effluent would swallow, the whole campus of the U of A and a chunk of the neighborhoods around it. Long before we split the atom, we were tampering with the wizard's book of spells. We wanted fire's fierce energy in a bottle, a barrel, a pipeline, and we got it. Energy to burn, to power the world, and generate wealth beyond our wildest dreams. But as big oil supercharges our economy and its own bottom line with record profits, it's also supercharging our atmosphere with record quantities of greenhouse gas. CO2 levels are now fully 50% higher than they were in pre-industrial times. Most of you are probably familiar with the Keeling curve of CO2. Charles Keeling came out of Caltech in the early 50s. He went to work with Roger Revelle at the Scripps Institution. These two men were pioneering American climate scientists, and it was Keeling who found a baseline for atmospheric CO2 measured in parts per million. And he didn't know if it was going up or down or anything, but he realized after taking readings along the coast of California through the mid-50s that it was going up. One way to understand capitalism as it's currently practiced is as a global Ponzi scheme powered by fossil fuels and leveraged against the future of almost all living things. In light of this, the most accurate way to calculate the debt on this system of fossil fuel powered, which is to say fire powered civilization, is by measuring CO2. And if we understand CO2 as debt, then heat is the interest on that debt. This chart runs back to 1850. We see natural fluctuation through the 19th century. It was a relatively cool period. It kind of hops up and down through the middle 20th century. And then mid-70s, it starts to warm. But that could be fluctuation. It goes up, it goes down, and then it really starts to climb. And look at 2023. Again, this massive jump. This is not natural. This is not natural fluctuation we're seeing here. So starting around 2000, global temperatures began rising steadily and noticeably. And what this tells us is that our CO2 debt level has become unsustainable and the interest unpayable, to the point that we now find ourselves in the default zone. And typically when we default on a loan, the bank calls in the debt. They might even repossess your stuff. So this is one way to understand the steady increase in fossil fuel-enhanced weather disasters. These floods, fires, heat waves, and intensifying storms are the bank of nature's repo men coming to collect on that debt, repossessing our homes, our cars, our coastlines, even our very lives. So these are billion-dollar storms, weather events in the United States. And again, look at the dates, 1980 to 2020. Compare it to the heat chart, compare it to the CO2 chart. They all track each other. So I wrote Fire Weather not to pick on Fort McMurray or the bitumen industry, but to demonstrate how and why catastrophic urban fire is now possible in any North American city or town. I grew up in New England. New England is burning right now. It's a week before American Thanksgiving, and there's a 5,000-acre fire burning on the New York-New Jersey border. Firefighters have been killed there in Connecticut, and in New York. It's really crazy. It's just unimaginable to me, having grown up there. That was just not part of any scenario I'd ever read about or knew about. 2 months ago, Vancouver, where I live now, narrowly dodged a disastrous fire. I wrote about that in the Globe and Mail, August 12th. So a more positive and forward-looking way to interpret the moment, this moment, is as a stern invitation to mature. And that's going back to this idea of kind of contraction and consolidation. It's really, we've been living beyond our means. So to mature out of petroleum-powered capitalism's dangerous delusion that A, nature is some kind of bottomless trust fund that we can draw on at will with no consequences, and B, that we're somehow in charge. I don't care what business you're in. Nature owns 51% of it, at least. Until we recognize the natural world as more than a full partner in everything we do, she will continue to remind us in progressively more violent ways, and she'll continue collecting on that debt. Canada is driving up that debt at a disproportionate rate. So these are CO2 levels among G7 countries, 1990 up to 2030. You can see there was a big jump right up until around 2010, and then most G7 countries, this kind of august group of wealthy, progressive, formerly progressive democracies, started really trying to rein in their CO2 emissions, all except Canada. We got to be clear on a couple of things. Coal is an 18th century fuel. Oil, which still drives about 80% of the world's economy and is the reason for about a third of blue ocean shipping, is a 19th century fuel. The internal combustion engine was prototyped in 1860. Standard Oil, Exxon Esso, was founded in 1870. Bitumen, of course, is not a fuel at all. It's a driveway sealer. In ancient times, it was used as mortar to stick bricks together. Here in Alberta, Dene people used it to seal their canoes. It takes billions of cubic feet of natural gas every day, every week, to melt and fractionate bitumen into substances American refineries are able to process. So why on earth are we still doing this, especially when scientists have understood the basics of the greenhouse effect literally since the 18th century? We've understood the heat-retaining qualities of CO2 since the 1850s. Scientists were speculating on industrial CO2's potential for altering the climate in the 1890s. The principal reason we labor so hard to liberate coal, oil, and gas from the ground is so we can burn it. In other words, if you're in the petroleum industry, you're in the fire industry, which means you're in the CO2 industry. And so this sort of might seem obvious or simplistic, but it took me 7 years to figure it out, because I am a creature of that world. All of us, we're born into a petroleum-powered, petroleum-fabricated society. Everything here is mediated through fire one way or another. A lot of us are dressed in petroleum distillates and all kinds of plasticated products that are super useful. And it's hard to see past it. And then to realize, wow, that most of this industry is serving fire. It's really about burning and burning and burning. And that's kind of a weird idea. That's a weird thing for a global civilization to be focused on at this stage of our development, when you think of how sophisticated we are in so many other ways. So what's alarming and probably indictable is the fact that the petroleum companies have known this for 50 years, actually about 75 years. In fact, they've been leaders in climate science. Some of you may have seen this graph. This is from an in-house memo from 1982 from Exxon. So they understood, starting in the 50s, that CO2 was a real issue, that CO2 was their issue. And quite earnestly, they set about trying to understand it better. And Exxon Esso was the wealthiest company in the world in the 1970s and 80s. They could hire the best scientists. There's a lot of science in the petroleum industry. They put some of them on the CO2 file, and this was the prediction they came up with. So this is based on late 1970s science. So we've got 1850 up to 2150. This is they're sort of gaming out the future of the climate based on 1970s science and demographic predictions. The horizontal arrow is what natural fluctuation would look like without the intrusion of anthropogenic CO2, industrial CO2. So you have fluctuation of, roughly a degree, up and down, up and down. And then they imagined what would happen if, based on late 1970s science, we kept expanding petroleum as it was growing at that time, and imagining demographics, imagining the growth of wealth, imagining the industrialization of other nations around the world. And that was their prediction, that second arrow heading up into the upper right-hand corner. Well, the expected range of fluctuations, where we start to see that and feel that in terms of temperature, is right around 2000, which is right around when most of us really started to notice. But remember, these guys are still in the late 1970s. They are predicting this, and they predicted it incredibly well. They're very good scientists. Folks at Exxon are very good at what they do. So this presented a quandary. How do you separate oil from fire or burning from emissions? You can't. And so, starting in the 1980s, the industry, along with its allies in government and churches and finance and in the media, embarked on a disinformation campaign to disavow and undermine their own science. And they've been doing it ever since. And the center of that effort, one of the centers, is right here in Alberta. And so now, in 2024, we find ourselves in this untenable kind of dissonant contradiction. Even the Wall Street Journal, historically friendly to big business and big oil, has called them out. Last year, they published an expose entitled "Inside Exxon's Strategy to Downplay Climate Change." Imagine the National Post doing that. But that is what the Wall Street Journal did. And this strategy has a name. And again, Alex Steffen, the fellow from Berkeley, he calls it predatory delay, the deliberate slowing of change to prolong a status quo whose costs will be paid by others. And boy, are we paying. We're paying already. And it's really, really expensive. So the bill for Hurricane Helene, which was followed by Hurricane Milton, and which was joined by Hurricane John, which nobody even talks about, even though it trashed Acapulco for the second time in 11 months. But the bill for Hurricane Helene is, 150 billion, maybe 200 billion, and Milton is right behind that. These are, no amount of bitumen royalties are going to cover that. This begs a question every Albertan and every Canadian should be asking, all of us. How is it not a crime to knowingly, willfully, enthusiastically sabotage the future, as the petroleum industry and its colluding investors and governments are doing now? And why would someone do that? John Kenneth Galbraith, a U.S. economist, ambassador, and author, born in Canada, wrote, "People of privilege will risk their complete destruction rather than surrender any material part of their advantage." Consciously or unconsciously, I expect many of us do this too. Take a look at your pension. Take a look at your portfolio. Loyalty to the status quo, especially when it's profitable, is extraordinarily powerful and often corrupting, and I think it derives from an elemental instinct for self-preservation that some might call selfishness or even greed. But I also think of Chandra Linder. The city's on fire, but we still want to do our dry cleaning, or go to a conference, or graduate from university, or write a book. Just about all of us have plans for our day, for our lives, and they don't include climate change. So this is where we find ourselves in 2024. While temperatures spike around the globe, while cities and towns continue to burn and flood, petroleum executives are saying, in public, by the way, we are choosing profits over people and the planet. So we need to focus on this, and many people are. A quarter of Americans now live in states and municipalities suing oil companies over their climate deception. An important case in Ontario has also been granted permission to proceed. But we must also focus on the Earth, which is telling us by every means available that we need to transition away from carbon-intensive energy as rapidly as possible. And we can do this by choosing policy and elected officials who prioritize climate and environmental health, which is our health. And I know that's hard to do in Alberta right now. And we can make choices in our own communities and our own lives about how we derive and use our energy and about how we want to live. I want to show you something amazing that the UK did. So the UK, coal-powered, showed us how to be a fossil fuel-powered superpower. They wrote the book starting in the 18th century, and they did it with coal. And so what you see here is a whole lot of coal being burned. All through most of our lives, coal was a big part of the British economy, the big part of its energy system. And then you see carbon taxes introduced, and you see some other things happening. And now, in 2024, the last coal-fired energy plant was shut off in the UK. And that may not be super significant in terms of global climate, but it's really significant in terms of showing what a nation formerly powered by a really toxic substance can do. We can transition out. So if the UK can do that with coal, Canada can certainly do it with bitumen. This is British emissions, 1850s to the 2000s. They've dropped down to about 1870s levels of per capita emissions. That's significant. This is Texas. So who is Alberta's best friend? Who is their twin brother in the States? It's Texas. So Texas is oil central. I was just in Houston, where actually 60,000 petroleum jobs have been lost in the past decade, but where they are leaning into wind and solar harder than any other state. They're blowing California out of the water. That's the second line. And Texas went to Alberta, their good friend, and said, we have wind and solar that we would like to invest in and build with you. And we know what happened to that. It's really a tragedy, because look what Texas is doing. They're still fracking. They're still going hard on oil, but they also know it's not forever. But the sun and the wind are absolutely forever. We're in an incredible moment of energy transition. Again, it's very hard to feel that here, and why I really urge you to look around at the rest of the world, because amazing things are happening. And what's happening with battery technology is so exciting and so rapid. You know, we are just going to be in a different energy scenario, maybe not in Alberta, but in a whole lot of other places by 2030. So China right now is installing something on the order of 10 gigawatts of renewable energy every 2 weeks. A gigawatt would power 750,000 to 1 million homes, times 10, every 2 weeks. That's what you can do when you have a dictator. A dictator who follows the science, you know. It's not all bad. Touchy, I know. I mean, one of the things Jason talked about, we have to take our wins where we find them. And our allies are not always going to be the usual suspects. And then so we really need to keep an open mind right now. I want to leave you with a really potent word, and that word is reverescence. It means to revitalize, regenerate, and regrow. And this is what the earth wants to do. Growing, flourishing is the earth's default mode. After the fire passes over, this is what's waiting underground. You saw the photos. You know how hot it was. The heat coming, the radiant heat coming out of that wildfire was 500 Celsius. Those house foundations turned into kilns. They got up to about 1,000 Celsius. They couldn't find the toilets because the toilets vaporized. That's how hot it was. And yet, somebody planted tulips this far under the ground. everything is burning, everything is baking. That foundation is destroyed. It got so hot, it spalled and cracked. Every one of those foundations had to be torn out because they were too compromised to build over. And yet the tulips, those tender bulbs planted by human hands, ended up being the most durable part of that neighborhood. The only things that survived. So I took a teaching from that. Do your worst to me, and I will still return in beauty. And that is going to be the challenge of the 2020s. That's what's coming, and that's what we can do. That is a way we can respond. And I am down for that, and I hope you are too. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, John. John has graciously sort of offered to answer some questions, engage in some back and forth and some discussion with the audience.
Hi, John. I just loved the beginning of their book. You used one of my favorite techniques, which is to follow along minute by minute. And I'm just wondering how you did that.
Thanks for that. And I love craft questions. Things get super existential in these gatherings often, and I'm up for that, for sure. But so much happened in that fire. I completely underestimated the magnitude of it, the complexity of it, how many people were doing different things, how many different faces the fire had. And I wasn't even planning to necessarily have the fire be such a central part of it, but it just wouldn't stop. Because I'd interview somebody and said, yeah, and he'd say, now, was that on Monday? Or was that on Thursday? And I said, wow, there were 4 days. We got 4 days to cover? You know, I kind of had to, that is sort of a fallback position, if you will. When things get so overwhelming, and I talked about this with my editor, he said, well, just do chronological, you know, it works. Just do it like a diary and just kind of churn through. And that helps keep the reader oriented. Works for you, works for a lot of people. It really works for me. I like that style too, obviously. And it seemed to suit. It actually helped in the interviews. You can imagine, because we're not sleeping, they lost track of time. But by pinning them down on certain events and triangulating with other people and with news items, I was able to really, that was 5 in the afternoon on the Wednesday. So that means, you know, Paul was over here and Carol was over there. And that helps kind of create this sort of web of time and meaning, so it isn't all chaos. And it really felt like chaos for a lot of people in the middle, who were in the middle of it. And so this is a kind of Monday morning quarterbacking technique that enables us to deal with chaos in a more manageable way. And I'm glad it was successful for you. It really helped me a lot.
As you've said, in Alberta, it's very hard to talk about this stuff. How do you think we should go about it? I mean, during the Fort McMurray fire, we were all sort of told, don't talk about this in terms of climate change.
Yeah.
It's icky. And then, you know, last year, during our provincial election, this province was burning.
Yeah.
And the politicians, and that included, you know, the NDP as much as the UCP, would not say one word that linked the, you know, what was going on around us to climate change.
Yeah, we are living here in a kind of shrieking dissonance that would make an ordinary person go crazy. You know, it really is insane when you see the drought, when you see the temperatures, when you see the fire. A quarter of Fort McMurray was evacuated in May. You know, right around the same time, Rich Kruger was saying, I'm here to make as much money as possible, and everybody who works for me better watch out. That's basically what he said. And this was not a secret boardroom meeting. He told the press this, and the fires were burning in his province. A room I would really like to be in is to sit in a room with people who work in the industry, who work in the kinds of jobs you do, and let's get a big whiteboard and make a list of all the things that petroleum has given us. And not just in general, but personally. Like, what are the things that have really touched you about gas? And again, I grew up in that like most of us did. I like the smell of gas. I like the sound of a car. I love to drive. I love my rubber-soled shoes. Like, these are all things that, you know, some of my best, most ecstatic experiences have been driving across the United States. I drove across Canada, too. I've driven to Alaska. I've been all over the place in a car, you know, powered by gas. And you could do that in an electric car, too, and I hope to someday. But all of us had a relationship to that energy. It's really powerful. It does feel kind of disingenuous to dump on it without also acknowledging the debt that we owe it. And so how do we show gratitude and also say, and now it's time to move on? Because all the things that petroleum gave us, those are being taken away from us now by climate disasters. So there is a silent partner, if you will, to oil and gas, a byproduct, CO2 and also methane, and those impact our climate in ways that are taking things from us. Our peace of mind, our experience of summer, our experience of winter. The things that gas and oil used to help us enjoy are now doing the opposite. So we need to bravely look at that. So we need to be grateful on the one hand and brave in the other and open to change. And there was a time when a radical idea was an internal combustion engine. A radical idea was liquid fuel, you know, that wasn't seal oil, you know, that was more combustible. So we're good at this. We're good at changing. And vested interests are always going to resist that. Change is hard, harder for some of us. But that's kind of what I imagine. And I haven't had any invitations, you know, from Synovus or Suncor to do that. But I'm putting it out there. I understand people want to make a living and people want to make a good living. And when you work in a particular community, that often shapes your worldview. If you work in a particular community, if you start saying things that might appear critical of that community, that compromises your position in that community. And our social systems, our support systems, those are the most important things to us. We don't want to compromise that. I know, I can understand why it might be pretty quiet up in Fort McMurray around climate, even though there are plenty of smart people up there who understand science. There are scientists up there. You know, it's not as simple as that. To embrace complexity and yet at the same time call out gaslighting and deceit and, oh no, now's not a good time. Well, when the hell is a good time? We get to say that too. That's in our future somewhere. We're going to do it. We will get there.
I have a son who just started working at the nuclear research station at Chalk River. He just told us about these mini nuclear power plants, right? And he said that they're actually self-quenching. So when things start going wrong, they just shut down and there's no down to it.
Yeah.
So have you heard about that? And what do you think about that as how much of a contribution can it make to helping us?
So that's way above my pay grade. I'm just not a nuclear guy. That does sound a little bit too good to be true. But on the other hand, an electric light is sort of too good to be true, too. You know, it's really amazing that we can just flip a switch and just all see each other in the dark, you know. I would have an open mind about that. But something interesting about China, China's super practical and super interested in self-preservation, 6,000-year-old civilization that sees itself in continuity. They had a plan to get off coal, and they're doing that ferociously. But part of the plan 10 years ago had been to have a large percentage of their zero-carbon, low-carbon energy generated by nuclear power. And then Fukushima happened, that earthquake and tidal wave that hit Japan and wiped out that power plant and destroyed the town and toxified everything. And they pivoted. And China, they don't quail easily, you know. And you could see why they would just charge ahead. That's not going to happen to us. But someone said, no, that is too risky. And so instead, They took the resources intended to develop their nuclear, which is slow and expensive at the best of times, and redirected it into wind and solar. And so that is where their emphasis seems to be going now. And they are super smart, very future-oriented, very survival-oriented, don't quibble with the science in the same way that we do. They might mess with it in other ways, but they made an interesting choice to steer away from nuclear, and that's something, it's not a, that means you shouldn't do it, but it's something to really pay attention to. So that's about as much as I can add to that. That's super interesting. You know, maybe your son is going to lead us into some amazing new world. I don't know.
I was glad you mentioned China because they have more nuclear plants under construction than all the rest of the world put together. And Japan is also restarting their nuclear reactors. But your picture of the mine at Fort McMurray, now I challenge everyone to look at Cominco's or any of the northern Saskatchewan mines, uranium mines, and compare those two. And the one is producing no carbon product, and the other is fueled by carbon to make carbon. I can understand the oil companies being against nuclear, but I can't understand why the left is against it. So that's my...
Yeah, there are some downsides for sure, and in fairness to China, China is doing more of everything than the rest of the world is doing. There's no question that super complex. People with the means are trying different methods and modes. Probably keeping an open mind is a good idea, but also noticing what has gone wrong in the past. And nuclear plants have a lot of downsides in terms of waste. Another issue about cooling them is the water's warmer now. The ocean's warmer now. The river is warmer now. And so nuclear power plants that are water cooled from natural sources are not as able to cool themselves because the water is actually warmer. And so that is only going to increase in temperature. We have our work cut out for us, and they're these sort of unseen, unforeseen downsides that will be revealing themselves in some really inconvenient ways as we go along.
I want you to comment on another aspect from the wildland firefighter. I've had a whole career in it. And one thing that governments have not realized, and the general population have not realized, is that we're at the end of what humans can do to mitigate these disasters. You saw the water vaporizing in the sky. When those water bombers, they drop that water, it turns to steam and it goes straight up. If Alberta decided to spend $20 billion on 300 water bombers tomorrow, they'd have to get in line with half of Europe right now. They couldn't build them for another 15 years. We do not have any more young people willing to put their lives on the line to do that. So it's not just a matter of putting technology to try and defeat this enemy. It is dealing with the fact that we do not have the resources to deal with things beyond normal human endeavors.
Mr. Dempsey and I have been in conversation through Twitter for probably a couple of years now, and he knows what he's talking about. He came by his information and experience the hard way, and this is a resource. I hope I can, invite other people to talk to you, because everything that Mike has said has been borne out by the research that I've done, except Mike has lived it. I've only researched it. When a wildfire is projecting 500 Celsius radiant heat, as the Fort McMurray fire did, water has no effect. What we're seeing in California and Australia and other places are these new ratings. It's kind of like, does the amp go up to 11? Well, fire does go up to 11. And so what they're saying now is that for the catastrophic fire rating in several states in Australia is that the warning is leaving ahead of time is your only option. You cannot stay and fight it. If you do, you're risking dying because normal methods no longer work. This is nature telling us something. We really have to get the memo. And rather than, we'll just build a bigger bomber, there's some big honking jets dropping retardant in water over California now. They got night vision goggles. We can fight her 24/7. But when it's pushing 500 Celsius, that's nature's way of just sort of flicking the flies away. So that's a real factor. We got to cool it. So that's the supreme challenge that that faces us. And I do wish we could hear more from, bomber pilots and hose people and people who are really living this reality, because they see it and they feel it physically. Thanks.
Hi, John. My name's Gil McGowan, and I have the honor of serving as the elected president of the Alberta Federation of Labor. Just a couple of observations based on my years of experience with our members, including thousands who work in oil and gas. The first is that when Albertans think of the economy, they think of oil and gas. When Albertans think of their identity, they think of themselves as oil and gas. When we're talking about how to convince a population like ours to accept change and embrace it, we're talking about people going against their own identity, rejecting this notion that our economy is oil and that moving away from it would be disastrous. It seems to me that the solution lies in the realm of psychology as much as it does in climate science, because you can't make change in the order that we need it to unless there is political will and political buy-in. I have this question for you. You interviewed a lot of people from our communities, from Fort McMurray, for that book. Have you kept in touch with them? And have they, after living this experience, changed their view as Albertans? And are there any lessons to learn from your experience with those people who you interviewed for the book?
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming. And I really hear you. I do think it's in the realm of psychology. A lot of these conversations need to start with "thank you for your service." The way we would talk to a firefighter, or a police officer or a soldier, there need to be alternatives being offered, not just, wow, you're really doing a terrible thing and you're destroying the planet, so stop. That's really not going to work for any of us, And a lot of us are doing things just incidentally that aren't great for the planet. We're all in this together, and we need to own that collectively. I didn't really get into climate with my interviews. I did a lot of interviews, and I just got to say right here that, so I'm a lefty liberal guy from Vancouver, and they have whatever opinions they have about people from Vancouver, but imagine a guy like that coming up right after the fire and saying, "Hey, I'm John from Vancouver, tell me about the worst day of your life." So there's a 2-word answer to that. That's totally justified, really. Not a single person said that to me or anything like it. People were so gracious to me in Fort McMurray. People were so honest with me. So you really want to hear about it? You got some time? And 3 hours later, like, we're both crying. That's, what some of the interviews were like. That's why the book is good, is because of them. This book is going into Arabic, going into Chinese, going into Polish. I will take some credit for that, but the voices in that book are what give it the heart and give it its authenticity and veracity and shock value. When you hear Wayne McGraw talking about trying to save his house because he doesn't want his snowmobile collection to burn up, he was ready to give his life for it. He really cares about those things. That's where he's at. And he paid the ultimate price for trying to do that. So, you can't not admire him. But what's interesting is there was not a single person volunteered, wow, this fire really seemed worse than the others, and it's probably because of X. And because of the nature of insurance, you need to, if you want full replacement value, you got to build the house again right there. And not everybody wanted to stay. A whole lot of people left. And that was their way of just, I don't want to be in that space anymore. But this city built itself back in its own image, vinyl siding, and they increased petroleum production. So they pretended like it was an aberration, and they honestly responded the same way Texas towns do after a mass shooting. Wow, that was terrible, and I'm going to go to church, and we're all going to just move on. And there's not a lot of analysis. There's not a lot of insight. We're just going to soldier on. And on one level, that's admirable. On the other hand, it also feels there's opportunities here that are being missed. What a lot of us thought on the climate side was that as people go through these disasters, we are going to have, the ranks of believers and activists will swell. As you get flooded out and burned out for the first time in 100 years, and you start connecting the dots, and you're going to start being an activist for decarbonizing. Well, that isn't what happens. What happens is the same thing that happens after school shootings. Those people sort of disappear because they're trying to just get their life together. They're trying to get their kid to eat again. They're trying to sleep through the night without having a nightmare. They're trying to stop the panic attacks. There are tens of thousands of people in Canada with PTSD now who didn't have it 10 years ago. And it's climate related, it's fire related. It's really scary and stressful to evacuate or go through a fire. And so those folks don't have a lot of bandwidth for doing this. They're just trying to keep it together. And like, where do I live now? Where do I move now? Where do I go now? How do I relate to this place now? How do I be in Alberta knowing what fire can do, and now it's May and I'm smelling smoke, and how do I just keep my heart rate together? That's what a lot of people are doing, quietly and bravely, soldiering on. But it comes at a cost, and one of the costs is the bandwidth that they have available to look at alternative ideas.
There are two things I wanted to mention. One was the thing about not being able to know what's going to happen anymore. We humans were used to a linear sort of progression of things, but many things in physics, in the natural world, are exponential. Some non-mathematical people might want to know that that's something that is growing very quickly. For example, computers doubling every 18 months, but I'll use the example of 2 years. Every 2 years, they double. So after 2 years, it's going to be twice.
Yeah.
But after another 2 years, it's 4. And another 2 years, it's 8, 16, 32. And a lot of your curves show that. So that's quite a natural thing that occurs. That's why it is extraordinarily difficult. Whereas we used to be able to have some sense of what's happening tomorrow because we knew what happened before. You cannot fathom that any longer because of that, because things are changing so quickly, where it's really starting to steepen. That's one thing. And the second thing is this idea that you'd use the phrase, well, that wasn't natural. These other things, they were natural, but that wasn't natural. Everything is natural. We divide ourselves from nature, but we are part of nature. Everything that happens is natural. And that is a disconnect that we have in our thinking. Just our egos, I presume, have separated us from nature, whereas we are all part of it. And so where I'm going, and I'm not a negative person, I'm a very optimistic person, but where I'm going is with your last comment that look at this. Mother Earth, it's going to come back. The grass will grow again. So maybe this is just Mother Earth's way of saying, well, the species has seen their time. It's going to unfold, and we'll be taken care of, and the next thing will happen. When Richard Feynman was studying the Challenger disaster, and he was criticizing some of the things that the engineers would say, and also more of the politically oriented people, he said, nature will not be fooled. All this denial, all this misinformation, it will not be fooled. It's going to unfold. Thank you.
Well, I don't know how that helps people with kids, really. I hear what you're saying. So for me, when things get really intense and I feel despairing, I kind of retreat to history and look at precedents and look at the kind of general ebb and flow of culture and society and civilizations. You could say, from a Martian's point of view, well, it's natural for human beings to pump excess oil out of the ground and goose the climate to the point that it becomes unlivable. But you got to look at who is doing it. And the fact is it's a tiny percentage of the population doing it, and a lot of it is being done to serve shareholders. And so the way capitalism works is it makes sociopathy okay. And it's okay to want your bottom line to be better. It's okay to want your RRSP to grow. But we don't look at the costs incurred on nature or the violations that are perpetrated in order to make those RRSPs grow. And so that's the part that I don't think is natural. I think that is intentional and willful and cynical, especially when you know what the impacts are. You know, I'm not beating up on you or even disagreeing with you. Like, I think you and I are on the same page, and I think you know a lot more about physics than I do. I respect that. But we have choices in agency here that animals don't, that natural systems don't. And we are making choices now. A very tiny percentage of the population are making choices now that are compromising the future for the rest of us. We really do need to take our wins where we find them, but also look at the positive examples and move toward that. So we need to educate ourselves about the companies, about the nations, about the states, about the towns that are taking progressive action, like Paris. Paris is transforming itself into a cycle, pedestrian, and transit-friendly city when for a century it sort of led the world, certainly the Western world, as this cultural icon that was constantly choked with traffic and polluted with smog. And one mayor with a city council is making this incredible transformation. And so that is super powerful. I think there's a lot that can be done at the municipal level. That is one thing we can do. Another thing we can do is get off Amazon Prime.